If I take $1 billion and I buy gold, I have a 30,000 pound lump of gold sitting in a vault in the basement of JP Morgan in New York City. You can't rent it. No one's going to live in it. It's hard to mortgage it. You can't, you can't put a lien on it. You can't develop it. How do I upgrade the value of gold? Like a London good delivery 400-ounce bar is like probably the highest value gold. If I make a jewelry, it probably won't be upgraded. So it's challenging to develop gold or generate yield on gold. If I made it digital gold, then I can move it at the speed of light, and my maintenance costs fall and my custody rights increase. And then what you realize quickly is it's not gold, it's property.
Fun studying and really diving into your company, who you are, your past. I want to talk about something that really intrigued me that I think would be a good starting point. Can you explain to everybody watching the importance of staying intellectually fearless and kind of what that means, as well as first principle? Because it seems as if that philosophy is what allowed you to really understand Bitcoin when you first started consuming that and studying it.
Yeah, well, I think what I learned at MIT was you should think for yourself. But my first memory of my first week at MIT was I'm sitting in a material science class, and a professor who's a consultant for NASA walked out and he said, "This tile just burned off the space shuttle on re-entry. NASA doesn't know why. And they're not sure how to solve the problem. Why do you think it burned off? And what do you think we should do about it?" There's a bunch of 18-year-old kids, and we'd all come from high school. And in high school, the answers are at the back of every book. And everybody looked at everybody, and you could see what was going on in their head, because their first thought was, did I not read the assigned reading for this lecture? And was there an answer to this that I didn't read? And then they all realized that there was no assigned reading, and the answer was not in the back of the book. Horror. And then they thought, whoa, this guy wants us to figure it out for ourselves. And then they thought, well, actually, people at NASA don't know why, and he doesn't know why. And then you thought, he actually thinks we're smart enough to figure something out for the first time in the history of the human race. And that's a big light bulb when you realize that, there are actually problems to be solved that no one that's ever walked on the face of the earth ever solved. And then once you get over that idea that you got to think for yourself and solve problems, that's very empowering. And, then the rest of decent education is all about learning principles, right? Principles of engineering, principles of physics, principles of mathematics, principles of science. How does one work through something? And I think it's more important than ever today, because there are so many models. There are models that we use to run our life, and those models are relevant as long as all of the boundary conditions still hold true. For example, there's a way to design a building on Earth, and that works as long as the gravitational constant's the same. But if you were designing the same building on Jupiter, or the same building on Mars, or the same building on the moon, you might not design it the same way. And if you're designing a machine, it doesn't work the same. And you study things like how to design an airplane. The speed of sound matters, but the speed of sound is a function of the density of the air, right? And the speed of light matters. And once you start to take into account the fact that some of these constants change, or the whole speed of a ship is a function of the Reynolds number and the density of the fluid you're moving through, you can design a ship, you can design a plane, as long as all those constants don't change. But then when I tell you to design that thing in a world where the fluid's got a different density and the gravitational constant, or the gravitational force is different, now you're an engineer. And of course, you have to think like an engineer if you're going to build things that fly through space, or things that fly through the air, or things that float through the water. You have to think that way. But a lot of times people don't think about that in economics. and they don't think about frames of reference. And it's pretty important to understand your frame of reference. Like, for example, is the money supply expanding at 0% a year? Because if it's expanding at 0% a year and I pay you 5% interest on a bond, it's not a bad deal. It's pretty good. But if the money supply is expanding at 10% a year and I pay you 5% interest on a bond, you're losing half of your money every 12 years. And if the money supply is expanding at 20% a year, then your negative real yield is minus 15%. And now you're losing all your money in like 5 years. So this frame of reference matters. And once you understand how to think from first principles, then instead of accepting things blindly, like, oh, well, 60-40 portfolio makes sense. Put 60% of your money in equity and 40% in bonds. Well, it only makes sense if everything has a positive real yield. And there's a circumstance under which all the bonds are worth nothing. But you know what? If you think from first principles, you realize that every equity, every stock you own is valued partially on its property component, a component of scarcity, and partially on its bond component, the expectation of cash flows. And so if you're holding a value stock with no growth that yields 5% dividend interest, that's just like a bond that yields 5% interest. They look the same, which means that it's a currency derivative. So when you evaluate economics, you have to be able to think from first principles. What does currency mean? What is a bond? What is a stock? What is property? How do you value property? How do you value a stock? How do you value a bond? How do you value a currency? What is value in the first place? What's the relationship of currency and value to energy? What's the relationship of energy to matter? Einstein said you can't create or destroy energy, right? Matter is energy, E = mc². It's the big finding of the 20th century.